Hey, this is Cameron. Welcome back to the Busy Gardener channel. If you're like me, you like getting a nice big piece of fruit, something that's meaty, juicy, like imagine a peach, a fresh peach, and you take a bite and all that juice is running down your chin, or a big apple that's crunchy, you take a bite and it takes you like 3 minutes to get down to the center where those seeds are. And then you plant your own trees and you don't have the same experience. The fruit is small, you're just biting it, it's almost like there's a seed in every bite. And it's because there's a secret trick that commercial growers do that I'm gonna share with you. It's called thinning. I'm gonna tell you how to do it. I'm gonna give you the courage to do it. Let's get busy. In this video, I'm gonna show you what kind of fruit needs to be thinned, when to thin it, and if you stay tuned to the end, I'm going to share with you what happens if you waited too long to thin your fruit and how to take care of that. So let's get into it. Oh, I love when I roll up on a tree like this Double Delight nectarine and it's just loaded with fruit. Look at that. It's probably 150, 200 fruit on this little tree. And I think, yes, I made it. Look at all this fruit. And then I get that fruit if I just leave it and let it do its own thing. And I try it and I'm like, there's just a pit in here. And it's because we've got different objectives, this tree and I. My objective is to get big, tasty fruit that I love to just bite into and have a bunch of juicy flesh that I'm eating. And the tree, on the other hand, wants to do something totally different than that. It's not interested in me having big giant fruit to enjoy. It is trying to create as many seeds as possible. It wants these seeds to go off, be taken somewhere by some animal, and to make lots of more little trees, and that's its objective. And so the idea of thinning just refers to removing fruit from a tree. Something the commercial growers do very regularly, and what that does is it kind of hacks the system of the tree and tells the tree, hey, if you're going to be putting this much energy into fruit production, divert all of that into just these remaining fruit. Does that make sense? So there's a certain amount of capacity, of fruiting capacity that a tree has, and what we want to do is to maximize that and direct that into a select few fruit as opposed to just a ton of little tiny fruit. I'm going to show you what I mean by that and how to do that. Hey, and before we get into the thinning, why don't you let me know in the comments below, have you thinned your fruit tree before? If you have, are you happy with the results? And if you haven't, what's been the biggest reason you haven't thinned your fruit tree up until this point? Let me know, I want to check it out. So what is the optimal time to thin your fruit? Generally speaking, you want to thin your fruit anywhere between 1/2 inch size to 1 inch size. If you thin it too early, then sometimes these things can develop like a split seed or split pit, which is not good. And if you wait too long, then you lose some of the benefit of it being thinned. In other words, the remaining fruit won't necessarily grow big enough. And so you want to thin, depending on the fruit, between 1/2 inch to 1 inch, anywhere in there, and you're likely thinning okay. So let's compromise. 3/4 inch is ideal. Now, when it comes to deciding how much of the fruit to thin off, there's a whole ratio of how much a tree is able to support, and there's a ratio between the number of leaves and the number of fruit. That's done by, they go and count all of the leaves on a tree, they go and count all of the fruit on a tree, they run experiments. I don't know what that ratio is, I don't care what that ratio is, because I'm not going to be counting leaves. But what I can do, and what you're going to be able to do, is to just know what the general spacing ought to be to accomplish that type of ratio. So here's what you want to keep in mind. For larger stone fruit, like peaches and nectarines and plums, you're going to want to have those thinned to about every 3 to 5 inches. So in other words, if you look down this stem, which has maybe a dozen fruit on it, if this entire thing is only 18 inches long, then you're going to want to, what, 6 to 5 or 6. You can divide it either by 3 inches, which would be 6 fruit, or 5 inches, which would be 4 fruit, like 3.5, 4 fruit.
4 feet, just find it, cut twice, measure once.
This is so confusing. I'm doing this on the spot math stuff again. Okay, let's talk about the amount of fruit that we want to take off of a tree. If we're talking about stone fruit, there are like two main categories of stone fruit and how you approach the thinning. One is the larger stone fruit like peaches and nectarines and plums, and the other are the smaller stone fruit like apricot and cherries. And this peach here, this Saturn peach, it's a white flesh donut shaped peach, really tasty. This is going to be a larger peach or a larger stone fruit, and so we want to thin this to every 3 to 5 inches per fruit. So that means on this stem, this maybe 18-inch stem, where there are like a dozen fruit on here, what we're saying is that we want to space a fruit roughly one every 3 to 5 inches. So if this thing is 18 inches long, that means that this is going to need like 4 to 6 fruit left on this entire stem. So you might be wondering, how do you decide which ones to take off? Well, I'm glad you asked. So as you approach your tree, especially if the fruit is all really close together like this, the stuff you want to take off is you want to take off any fruit that is blemished. You want to take off any fruit that is stuck onto another piece of fruit. Ideally, you're going to take those things off. You're going to take off the smaller fruit, leaving the larger fruit. Because if the fruit is already larger, chances are that's going to develop into a nicer, bigger piece of fruit. So you're wanting to leave on the kind of fruit that you would want to buy. So looking at this little thing here, I want to stress that the number of fruit that you leave on the stem, it doesn't have to be exactly 3 to 5 inches. If you find that there's more fruit at one end or the other, you can thin more heavily or lightly. What we're going for is an average here. So you want roughly 4 to 6 on a stem of this size, 18 inches. And this thing, by the way, this little Hip-Trug, Corona or Burgon and Ball sells these, and this is wonderful. You want to ideally not have all of your spent fruit on the ground because that can invite little pests and critters. Rule number 1 of thinning fruit is as you're thinning the fruit, don't look down because you're going to be shocked at the amount of fruit that is being wasted off of the tree. Okay, so here I see, for example, this double peach. You see how that's just stuck together? That's gone. And I'm just trying to, again, take off the tiny fruit, leaving the larger fruit. And so an easy way is just figure out how many knuckles wide 3 inches is, 4 inches is, 5 inches is, and then you can just use your hand as kind of a measuring gauge. Now, something I would also like to recommend is as you're thinning your fruit, I would favor leaving your fruit toward the center of the tree a little bit. So I might thin a little more heavily at the ends and leave a little bit more on the inside. And the reason is, the further out on the stem that this goes, it's going to want to pull the branch down, and that can lead to more breakage. It's just like if you're holding a heavy object far away from your body as opposed to close to your body. This is a lot heavier than this. And so I'm going to leave more fruit on the inside. Let's see, so 1, 2, 3, 4. Doesn't have to be exact. Nice, my Hip-Trug is getting pretty full on these donut peaches. Now I need to do this Spice Z Nectar Plum. Isn't this beautiful? And there are a ton of fruit on here, and I'm going to start taking some of these off as well. Let's go check out these apriums over here. Oh yes, this cotton candy aprium. This aprium, it's an apricot plum hybrid, favors the apricot, and this thing is so happy here. So gorgeous and setting fruit. I love this. I love the foliage. I love the blooms. This is a fun one to have. This also needs to be thinned, and I'm going to show you how to thin this. Remember, this is the smaller one. Apricot and cherry are smaller generally than the plum, peach, nectarine, and so want to thin these to every 2 to 4 inches because there's a little bit, that don't get as big, so there's a little bit more carrying capacity here. One other reason why you're wanting to create spacing between the fruit and why you're not just leaving clusters of it is as that fruit sits there and the sides of them are touching, sometimes that can introduce some deformities. It can open up little sores there where as the fruit ripens, it can spoil the fruit, bugs can get in. And so giving that space lets that fruit hang all by itself without getting bugged by its neighbors. It's like kids in the backseat of a car. Apricot's touching me. Okay, we're going to follow the same best practices, and that means we're going to be removing the fruit that is smaller, any fruit that is deformed, any fruit that might be attached to another piece of fruit, like the two are just stuck together. Those will go, and we're going to leave the larger fruit that is unblemished so that we end up with higher quality fruit at harvesting time. Now I want to show you how to thin apple and pear pome fruit. Now, both pear and apples, they're related. They grow on these little fruiting spurs and they create these little clusters of fruit. And the way that you want to thin apples and pear is to thin each cluster down to 2 of the biggest fruit that are there. So you want 2 to 3 maybe fruit per cluster, favoring the largest ones. So I'm going to show you a close-up of this. So here you see we've got 5 total fruit. You notice that this one, and this one are the smallest of the bunch. And so by just pushing them off to the side, I'm able to knock those little fruit off. And this is right at the perfect size too. Remember we were talking about 1/2 inch to 1 inch? Well, this is perfect. This is maybe 1/2 inch in size. Same thing goes with this one here. This one's a little more complicated because these are all pretty good size. So again, we're wanting to favor, definitely this one's a smaller one. And this one's a smaller one. Oh, leaf, get out of the way. But now we're left with these kind of bigger ones. So we want to look for anything that is obviously deformed or anything. I don't see anything, so I'm just going to pop this one off. And that leaves us with 2 fruit that are going to grow big. Well, this is a good example of some fruit that is not desirable because of the stuff that's going on with it, regardless of size. This one you notice has this kind of weird scaling thing going on. This one has a little bit of that stuff going on too. So just removing those 2 will be the right choice. Okay, so we've talked through how to thin stone fruit and pome fruit. There's apples and pears, peaches, plums, nectarines, all of that stuff. Now I want to talk about what happens if you miss that window, that 1/2 inch to 1 inch window. What happens if you come in like these Arctic Star nectarines that are seriously like a month past when they should have been thinned? This thing is the size of a racquetball. It's crazy. I mean, I'm very happy about it. But now what happens? What are you supposed to do? It's any thinning that I do, it's way too late to increase the size of the existing fruit. But I'm still going to thin, and I'm going to thin aggressively, and here's why. This much fruit already, you can see, is weighing down the branch really significantly. And this is only going to get worse. As this thing grows and as this fruit expands even further, it's going to generally create limb breakage. So this entire limb could be lost, and that's destroying a ton of canopy and fruiting wood for subsequent years that would have otherwise been there. So I'm going to thin this very aggressively to get rid of all of this additional weight. So here we're not really thinning for fruit size, we're thinning to take care of and reduce the additional weight so your tree doesn't experience limb breakage. Something that also happens is if it sets a huge crop and you let it go, sometimes you can get your tree into what's called a biennial production, where it'll have one really heavy year, one really light year, because it's expending all of its resources one year and then it's needing the next year to recuperate. So thinning really heavily in this case is going to help as well. Again, I'm going to favor leaving some more fruit in toward the center and reducing the amount that's out at the edges of the branch to reduce the possibility of that breakage, because that is the most sad. The only thing worse than having birds eat all your fruit is to come and see an entire branch of the fruit not quite ripened, just laying on the ground. Now, this is a great example. Look at how much fruit is on this one single stem right here. We've got 5 fruit on this single stem. Now, I'm going to just remove that. I'm going to remove that. I'm going to remove that. I'm going to remove that. And so now we've got just this single fruit on this stem. And that's about the right amount for this small stem. Could you imagine this thing having to bear the weight of all that fruit? Okay, I got this Arctic Star nectarine all totally thinned out. A lot lighter in here, looking good, but I need to show you something. This is the reality of what thinning looks like, and so that's why they say the number one rule of thinning your fruit is you don't look down, because you'll just be shocked and you think, oh my goodness, all this good fruit. But look how nice and light the inside of this canopy has gotten. Nothing weighing anything down. The limbs and branches are all looking really, really good. Although I still see from the back side some of these others need to be thinned, but all in all, the the tree is looking really, really happy. And this is what you're going for. You're going for nice space between the fruit, not too much weight on any of these smaller limbs especially. If you've got a larger limb, then you can leave it on. But look at this. Look what I just found. Still more needs to be thinned out. This little branch can't support all of this fruit when it's fully grown. Okay, the thinning is all done. I've got a whole container full of thin fruit. I also have these thin flavor grenade pluots, which I'm gonna end up using to make like a jam and possibly even pickle some of them. I'm gonna put a link later to the Unhurried Farm video we're gonna do on a recipe for green plum jam. Anyway, this has been good. Hopefully this has encouraged you to get out there and thin your fruit. Do that thing. Your trees will thank you because their limbs won't break. You will thank you because you're gonna eat tasty, good fruit. And whether you've got one piece of fruit to thin in your orchard or 5,000, until next time, stay busy.